Great, thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Cormac Collier. I'm the executive director of the Nantucket Land Council. I think I'm familiar with most of the people in here. How you doing, buddy? Emily Molden, who was basically my colleague, resource ecologist, was instrumental for getting this together and getting this going. She couldn't make it today. She had a commitment off island that she had to get to, so she apologized for not coming. But she's really, as I am, very excited in being able to provide these opportunities to you, so you don't have to go off island to go and find credits and spend all the money to do that. So we're trying to really provide these opportunities for you at least once a year. Besides this type of class, we are looking for suggestions, ideas for anything as it relates to pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer use as well. April 15th is coming up soon. Actually, before I jump into that, how many people are landscapers here? Landscape companies. Golf course? People up there. And then conservation organizations. So we have a good mix: invasive species control, turf control, and then turf and some plants as well. April 15th, fertilizer for the golf course and the landscapers. I think since you're here, you guys are paying attention. You guys are the ones that actually are aware, so I don't need to be telling you this. Just check your soil temperatures. Don't go out and just put stuff down on the 15th if you don't need to. Look around who's in the room today. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for paying attention. I have the ability to come up here as a nonprofit person and say things that sometimes other people can't say, but we know there's so many people that don't have a license that are putting herbicides and pesticides down on the properties where they're not supposed to. I encourage you more than ever to get in touch with me, to get in touch with Jeff Carlson at Natural Resources, or to get in touch with the Board of Health to try and take it a step further in terms of enforcement. You guys are doing it right. You guys are paying attention in terms of the pesticides. So we encourage you to actually try to get other people in the mix as well. That is also with fertilizer. As you know, our fertilizer regs have been in effect for about four years now. Guys, Mark, Steve, about 3 or 4 years? 3 or 4 years now. Everybody should know that they're there. There's no excuse anymore. If you see somebody applying fertilizer that's fairly obvious that it doesn't meet the requirements and they probably are spreading it at a rate that is way too high, you can anonymously call them out, get in touch with me or get in touch with Jeff, and have some enforcement offers sent. I know that's uncomfortable in terms of talking about your fellow colleagues, but that's the only way this is going to work, is in terms of letting people know. So we really ask you to do that. And then finally, Fertilizer Committee. We have a Fertilizer Advisory Committee that advises the Board of Health on the regulations and other issues. Mike Miserelli is our chair. Steve's on it. I'm on it. Mark Lucas from the golf course industry is on it. Ben's on it. And then a couple other people on it. We need new blood. So if people are interested in joining, and from the conservation groups as well, if people are interested in joining, please join. We need some new ideas, fresh blood, and just some fresh people there. So with that, I do want to bring it to today's, Meg told me I have to advertise we have our sun shirts that Mike over at the Hall Over donated to us. They are for sale. They're at a reduced price now. They're really nice, long sleeve, Patagucci. They're for sale. We encourage you guys to buy them. It really helps us with our mission and our work that we do. So with that, we're here to take a pesticide class. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, and I'm going to screw up the name, sorry. Hotze Wijnja, and he is from the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources. Before I get going, I do have to do those required, I don't think the TV is going to pick me up on this one, but that's fine. The state is requiring me to show you these slides as part of the class. So if you want to just read through them real quick, it's basically don't use your phone. We're going to be keeping an eye on you. Steve, don't be destructive. Don't pretend like you're somebody else that you're not. things about signing the form. Meg, explain to you what was going on with the form, and she can say it right now.
Everyone has the certificate. That was the third paper I showed you where you have to fill out the applicator's information. If you could fill that out at any time, say before the second break, I'll collect those from you before the second break, and I'll give them back to you with your signature at the end of the day when you sign out.
Great. And please get in touch with me if you guys have any ideas, comments, anything as it relates to landscaping, turf care, or invasive species control in terms of what we can do to provide more educational resources to you. So with that, let's hear it from Hotze. Thank you.
Thank you. Can anyone?
Oh, I gotta sit.
Yeah, can everyone hear me or?
Please use the mic.
Do you want to get a mic, or can he speak up loud?
I don't know.
That one's live. Use it.
Well,
These are live, but they are not really.
we were just gonna
set up
we were
for-
just gonna use voice.
We got one. All right.
You got one?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Lee.
Does this work? Can you hear me now? Okay. Sounds like it. Thank you for the opportunity. This is my first time on Nantucket. So first time taking the ferry over. And I'm glad to be here to do some education and outreach on pesticides. I'm the environmental chemist in the program. I've been there now almost 10 years, and I have a background in soil and environmental chemistry. I joined the department to be the technical expert supporting the program related to environmental fate assessments. But as I developed my role in the program, I also became more familiar with the risk assessments, toxicology aspects of pesticides, and we have well, as the only chemist in the department, I get pulled in to various other programs. We are now regulating plant nutrients and fertilizers too, so I was also pulled into that. And but I'm focusing here on the pesticide regulatory program. And as part of the program, we do these kind of pesticide education events. We contribute to UMass, to the pesticide program. I was there last Friday and this Monday doing a similar presentation. And this effort to come out here to Nantucket, we are just not coming out here that often. This has been in the planning for a while. We were trying to be here in the winter, but finally I made it here, and so I'm going to talk about some environmental fate aspects of pesticides. Pesticides are released into the environment for purposes of controlling pests, but by just applying them and releasing them into the environment, they are subject to various different processes that basically make them move in the environment. They may move off target more or less and end up in parts of the environment where we don't like to see them, but there is no perfect scenario for the use of pesticides where you don't have to deal with weather and land and soil situations where you can prevent that. But pesticides are among the most regulated compounds on the market. The environmental fate aspects of pesticides are well studied and characterized, have to be, before pesticides can even be registered by EPA and also at the state level. And so compared to many other chemicals that are used, these actually have a data package, and there's a lot of work that goes into it before they become registered, and that's that is also addressed on pesticide labels. There is language on there that addresses the potential for environmental risk and human health, applicator health, and so that is all the outcome of all that work that goes on before it becomes registered. But then there's also then you come to the point where pesticides are being used, and the label only has some general language on there, requirements. You as well, some of you are applicators, still have to use your judgment to consider the situation where it is used, and by having some knowledge about the environmental fate processes that are relevant for the behavior of pesticides, it can help you to make a better judgment of how it should be used in a certain situation. I will also go over some tools that we use as regulators, and scientists use them, and they are some of them are relatively easy to use for even relatively lay people to get an idea of what the potential is for pesticides leaching in water, running off to water resources. And so I'm going to review some of those tools. I'm going to review some of the studies that have been done in the region about which pesticides are found in waters, and so I'm going to give some examples of that, and then I'm to go over the groundwater protection regulations that are in place, the Massachusetts groundwater protection regulations, and the requirements of those regulations, and then I'm going to go over some pesticides of interest. I was provided with a list of pesticides that are used here on Nantucket and where people have questions about, and so I'm going to go over that at the end. So. Next slide, please. I have a few introductory slides. I was preparing for this series of talks that I've been doing the last couple of weeks, and I was using a presentation from a few years ago, and I had some news items from that time, and I was like, okay, I can still use them because they are still in the news. The Cape Cod residents that have concerns about herbicides used in rights-of-way, that is an issue that is ongoing. Or the issue is that people have concerns, and so we actually have a special rights-of-way management program that is regulating the use of herbicides in rights-of-way. But on Cape Cod, as you probably know, is similar in situation to Nantucket, that they have a sole source aquifer, and they are concerned about impacts of these herbicides on drinking water resources. Next slide. There are studies out there. I'm going to review them later on. In some situations, they do find pesticides in groundwater and surface water, and that is possible because pesticides are being released into the environment, and they can leach and run off and get in water resources. The thing is that we have to make sure that they don't exceed levels of concern that are established based on the scientific studies. Next slide, please. So the neonicotinoid the neonicotinoid pesticides are still in the news related to potential impacts to pollinators. I'll touch on that later on too. Next slide, please. And that is again, that is something very much in the news because there are regulatory efforts to further restrict these pesticides, but there is a process ongoing that is underway at various places to address these concerns. And then the next slide shows Roundup. Roundup is still something that is very much in the news. Okay, so Roundup is very much in the news with its the efforts to ban it in several places, and so that is something that we are dealing with at the state level. Well, there are no efforts to ban it yet, but there are a lot of inquiries about what the regulatory process is and things that are underway for glyphosate-based herbicides. I'll touch on that later on too. So the first part of this presentation, I'll go over some environmental fate processes. Next slide, please. And so we are as pesticides are being used to address pest control, there are concerns about potential impacts, and so we are putting effort in awareness of pesticides, that they can be used in a way that shouldn't cause unreasonable impacts to human health and the environment. And so we do education to make sure that applicators are familiar with the regulatory requirements and with the best management practices. And overall, the effort is to minimize impacts from pesticides to human health and the environment. Next slide, please. And so this presentation will help you to understand the potential impacts from pesticide application, specifically on water resources. Improve the understanding of environmental fate processes relative to pesticide behavior. And that will help you to identify pesticide sensitive areas. And if necessary, you may have to adjust your methods to minimize impacts to water resources and other sensitive areas. It will help this presentation will go over the regulatory requirements specifically for groundwater protection, and hopefully it will also improve or your role and recognition of the importance of proper use of pesticides. Next slide. And so, as I pointed out, pesticides are released in the environment subject to various environmental processes, and the way they behave is determined by their characteristics. I'll go over that. The ways they move in the environment, the different routes they can follow, and degradation processes that are taking place. Some pesticides are based on their characteristics and the areas where they are used for. They are actually restricted based on concerns or potential risks for humans and environmental impacts. And so there are a number of pesticides that are on the groundwater protection list, as I will show later. And and they are among the restricted use pesticides. Next slide, please. So again, the environment, pesticides are released to do pest control, and they are released partially in the air to the soil. They may end up in water. They are in contact with plants and animals and people, and so they are released into various different components of the environment. Next line, please. There's also the potential for impacts to beneficial organisms, especially with insecticides. Next line, please. The water resources is of concern. And the next one. We regulators, as well as the public, have concerns. If pesticides are not properly used, there is a potential for risk to non-targets and human health, and that is something that needs to be ensured that the risk is not reaching levels of concern. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over the chemical characteristics of pesticides that are important for environmental fate. Understand and I will go over the ways pesticides move during and after application, and go over the processes by which pesticides degrade in the environment. And so all these different processes that take place determine the overall fate of pesticides. So it is usually not just one process that is dominant. It is the sum of all these different processes that basically determine where a pesticide ends up in the environment, at what level it can occur. And so that's where some of the modern computer models come into play, where they are very helpful in doing simulations to evaluate different scenarios. I will go over that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So solubility, of course, is an important property, the ability to dissolve in water. Some pesticides are much more soluble than others, and it determines the potential for that pesticide to either run off or leach into the ground and reach groundwater at some point. And for when we do reviews for new chemicals that are being registered in Massachusetts, we actually have a set of regulations that specifically addresses the groundwater protection, and water solubility is a criterion specified in the regulations. If it's greater than 3 ppm parts per million, then we flag it as a potential leacher. And so we'll take another look. Next slide, please. Some examples of solubilities. Roundup, or the active ingredient glyphosate, is very soluble in water. The active ingredient in Actara, thiamethoxam, for example, is also very soluble. In contrast, you have other chemicals that have very low solubility. They are what is known as hydrophobic. They don't like to be in water, and so they are very poorly soluble in water, and therefore they, based on that property, they have less potential for leaching and runoff. Next slide, please. Then another very important property is the ability of chemicals to adsorb to solid surfaces, soil, materials, organic matter. And there's also a wide range of ability of doing that when you compare different chemicals. But it is an important parameter. If chemicals have a high affinity for binding to soil surfaces, they will have less potential to migrate, and thereby less potential to leach and runoff. So that ability to bind is measured as the organic matter or soil water partitioning coefficient. Next slide, please. And just again, the groundwater protection regulations also have a criterion for that property. So there's the value of 1900, where we look at when we review a new chemical. And some examples are listed there. Glyphosate is among the chemicals that have the highest affinity for binding to soil. Whereas there are some others that have very low values, and if they are also soluble and have low binding ability, then they will have a high potential to leach and travel through the soil. Next slide, please. And then persistence is another parameter. If chemicals are persistent, they will be present on or in the soil, and they will, in some cases, that is a beneficial property if the purpose is to extend the pest control for a period of time. But in other situations, it is a property that can increase the potential for leaching and runoff, because it's going to be there for a while and subject to the environmental processes such as rainfall and percolation of water through soil. And if the chemicals can move with water, then there's more potential for impacts. And so persistence is measured as a half-life value. And so, for instance, one of the neonicotinoids, imidacloprid, is known to be very persistent in many situations. Half-life of over 200 days in certain situations, whereas some other pesticides have a very short half-life, in the order of days, and that is a major parameter determining the potential for leaching and runoff. Next slide, please. Volatility is, in some cases, a relevant parameter. If certain chemicals are much more volatile than others, and by volatilizing it, it will get into the air and then can travel through the air to nearby areas and deposit even in those areas again. So that is a potential route for exposure, especially for these somewhat volatile chemicals. And again, that ranges. There's a wide range of volatility. Caseron, diclobonyl is one that has a reasonable volatility, whereas the neonicotinoid thiamethoxam, for instance, is practically non-volatile. So that's where that route is not so relevant. Next slide, please. And so that was an overview of the major chemical characteristics that have relevance for environmental fate. Then something about how pesticides can migrate during and after application. Next slide, please. So by the air, I already mentioned the vapor drift, but a spray drift is, of course, one route too. A spray or particles that are associated with the application method, and due to environmental certain environmental conditions, spray drift can be significant, and that is something that needs to be minimized. Pesticides can move by water, so they can wash off from plant and soil surfaces and through soil erosion, and they can leach, of course, with water into the soil. And then pesticides can also move off-site by being associated with plants or crops and even animals. Next slide. So pesticide movement by water, we basically have two classes of scenarios. So we have a point source that is usually associated with either an accidental spill or a disposal situation. That is not the typical reason for finding pesticides in water. Mixing and preparing solutions should be done in a way that you shouldn't create point sources of pesticides. The other scenario is more relevant as you release pesticides on a site. You basically create a non-point source of pesticides that is subject to drift, runoff, and leaching. Next slide, please. And so that's the more important scenario that is being addressed also on labels. And there's a lot of studies that are done prior to registration to assess that potential of movement with water off-site. And so, next slide, please. Spray drift. I already mentioned it earlier. That is the movement of airborne pesticide droplets or particles from the target area. And there's many labels have spray drift language requirements and restrictions on there. Next line, please, on this slide. And so that is something that is something that will, with many application methods, will be taking place to some extent. It just needs to be minimized. And sometimes there are no spray buffers around sensitive areas. The equipment adjustments to control droplet size are relevant. Wind speed restrictions may be on the label, and some other aspects related to spray drift potential. Next slide. If you can just click through the, spray drift factors, there should be a site assessment. If setbacks are relevant to the site where you plan to do the application, equipment setup may be relevant, and viscosity of spray may have to be controlled to manage the spray drift. Next slide, please. And then, of course, weather conditions need to be considered at the time. And so, regarding droplet size, there is an optimum where the droplet size is such that the application can reach the target, but at the same time the spray drift is minimized. And so that's why droplet size is one of the important factors that may be on the label. Next slide. And so this is just an example of some spray drift language on labels where, as you can see, it is wind direction, wind speed, inversion restrictions, and buffers around sensitive areas. So those are all ways to manage spray drift. Next slide, please. Then pesticide movement, runoff into water. Runoff is the process of movement of water over the soil, and that then subsequently can get into ditches, streams, rivers, and ponds, and lakes. And thereby it can impact water resources that are used for drinking water, livestock watering, irrigation, etc. Next slide. And so the extent of runoff, it depends on the grade or slope of the application area. Soil texture is an important factor. Vegetation, whether that is present or if it is bare soil. Soil moisture level, amount and timing of the irrigation and rainfall, whether it is soon after application or much longer after that, and pesticide characteristics, as I reviewed earlier. Next slide. And so you may find on the label some language that addresses that potential impact to surface water, in this case, where I'm focusing on. There may be surface water advisory language. So that is language that is on the label to inform applicators that they should take a closer look at the vulnerability of the site where the application is going to be done. The label may not have setback values on there, but it is this language is to alert the applicator about the potential and take another look at what the specific application site, how vulnerable that is, and if any caution and further restriction is needed there. Next slide. Leaching. Leaching, the process of movement of pesticide by water through the soil. If you can click that. So that can move horizontally sometimes and thereby get to roots of trees or plants that may be impacted, or vertically deeper into the soil where it can reach ultimately groundwater resources. Next slide, please. And so clearly water-soluble pesticides are more susceptible to it, and also pesticides with low adsorption affinity will be more susceptible to leach, and pesticides that are persistent, that have the time to be traveling deeper into the soil. So the leaching in terms of the site characteristics, factors such as geology, the next lines, soil texture and structure. Sandy soils allow faster percolation and provide fewer binding sites. Silt and clay and organic matter slow down leaching in general. And the depth to groundwater is an important factor. You may find that even on labels. Do not apply to sites where shallow water tables are present. And then amount and timing of rainfall or irrigation relative to the application time. And so labels may have language that, again, inform the applicator about the potential for groundwater impacts through the groundwater advisory language. Yeah, that alerts the applicator again that if your site is a site with water tables that are shallow and the chemical properties are such that it may be impacted, and so extra caution should be taken when using the product on those sites. And sometimes there's soil information on there too. Okay, so that was something about the ways pesticides move. Now something about the pesticides, how pesticides degrade, the different processes degrade in the environment. Most organic chemicals over time break down to the smaller constituents and ultimately to CO2 and water and inorganic salts. So they over time they degrade and disappear. But there are different processes that can take place. Next slide, please. When we review new chemicals for groundwater protection status, we look at that too. There is the regulations specify the criterion of half-lives of more than 7 days, which is not that long actually. Many chemicals meet that criterion, and so that is something we look at, and if it is more than 7 days, we flag it as a potential leacher. So degradation processes that can occur are biodegradation, breakdown by contact with water sometimes is a process that is relevant, breakdown by light, and by plant uptake are all processes that can take place that ultimately degrade chemicals. Next slide, please. Microbial degradation is a very important process, a process that takes place in many environments, in soils, in water, where microbes consume and break down pesticides. In some cases, populations of microbes can develop with repeated uses of certain pesticides that they actually break down things faster. But yeah, conditions that favor microbial degradation are warm and fertile and moist soils, pH, and the aeration of the soil are all factors that come into play. And in some cases, it is the process of that is allowed to take place when water is present in holding ponds where it is allowed to break down before the water is further released into streams and rivers. That is something that they sometimes have with cranberry bog systems. Next slide, please. So certain chemicals are actually subject to what is known as hydrolysis. They react with water and break down. That is typically significant at high pHs. So with most normal environmental conditions, the pH doesn't reach those values that it is that significant. But moisture content and plays a role, of course. But yeah, it is in general not the most important process for breakdown. But for certain chemicals, it can be a contributing factor. Next slide. Sunlight can be a factor in breakdown for certain chemicals. It can be significant, especially when it is applied as a foliar process and exposed and is exposed to sunlight for an extended time. It can, for certain chemicals, can be an important route of breakdown, and so that sometimes can be minimized if it is a soil-applied herbicide or a product, then it can be incorporated to minimize that. Plants can also take up pesticides and break them down, metabolize them, and thereby make the chemical disappear. Next slide. And so, again, there are many different things that take place at the same time. And so, ultimately, is the combination of all those processes that add up to an overall environmental fate. And so that is next slide, please. That is how you get to an overall disappearance rate or environmental fate profile. And so if you have a soluble chemical that is persistent, it will have the potential to leach a runoff. If it also degrades very slowly, then it is it has a high risk for causing water contamination. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we have just two comparison or two pesticides with different property profiles. One has the pesticide A has a relatively low adsorption coefficient, as you can see, of 100. It's much lower than that regulatory criterion of 100. Half-life is pretty long, 142 days. Solubility is substantial. Compare that to pesticide B, has a much higher adsorption coefficient. Half-life is longer, but solubility is much lower. But these are things where we look at when we review new chemicals, and this is one aspect, the leaching properties. We also look at the toxicological criteria, and then determine whether a chemical should be on the groundwater protection list or not. Next slide, please. That's what I just mentioned. That's the leaching potential, but toxicological concern is something where we take a look at where it is typically the carcinogenicity classification that determines whether the regulatory criteria are met. Next slide. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, all these different processes take place at the same time, and since computer models came along and have evolved now to very helpful tools for scientists and regulators, they are capable of simulating these different processes, and so they are helpful tools to quickly evaluate different scenarios. What pesticide concentrations can be in groundwater and surface water when you have a given scenario, a given chemical, and see what the important factors are. Next slide, please. And so one simple model that is very simple but helpful to create a picture of where chemicals end up. It basically simulates the jar test, where you have you put soil in a jar, add some water, add the chemical, shake it up, allow it to sit and establish an equilibrium, and see where it ends up, mostly in the water, mostly in the soil, and so that's just one model that can give you an idea what chemicals do in the environment. Next slide, please. So these are some examples. This is methoxyphenicide, an insect growth regulator that is actually on the groundwater protection list. So that shows that a fraction, about 70%, would end up in the water, where most of it actually ends up in the soil, and practically nothing in the air due to its low volatility. The other one showed a whole different, was mostly into soil. Imidacloprid is a chemical that has a reasonable solubility, doesn't bind that strongly, ends up in the water to some extent, where when you compare it with bifenthrin, you see that bifenthrin is not ending up in the water at all due to its low solubility and extreme high binding affinity. So these are simple pictures that show something about where it could end up. Next slide, please. A few more examples. 2,4-D, a very common herbicide that is soluble and has a significant fraction ending up in the water. And compare that to fipronil, which is much more strongly binding to soil. Next slide. And then Thiamethoxam, one of the neonicotinoids that is actually on the groundwater protection list too, and this illustrates probably a good reason why. It is not binding strongly to the soil. It is soluble, so it ends up in the water to a significant extent. And the contrast is with the other one, indoxacarb, that is again binding strongly to the soil. So that was a very simple model. The more advanced models that are now used by regulators and scientists are typically include the what is known as the pesticide root zone model that was developed by EPA, started in the 1980s and now has evolved in a very comprehensive model that is used worldwide by pesticide regulators and scientists. And so I use that model too to evaluate scenarios. It is a model that requires a lot more input and information that you have to have about the site, about the soil, the crop, the chemical. But once you have that input information available and enter it, you can quickly evaluate different scenarios. And so I use that, for instance, to evaluate some pesticide use on Cape Cod and the leaching potential of those chemicals into a soil that is typical for Cape Cod. And so the next slide shows the profile. So this is just a soil map unit, so the information about the soils, about the texture and organic matter content and other chemical parameters is available there. You provide the model with that information. And then the next slide shows, I believe, the modeling results in terms of where the chemical ends up in the profile, and it compares the situation with an organic top layer that is naturally present in this soil profile, but it also it was modeled without that organic top layer. And so in the first diagram, you see that the chemical with the organic top layer present basically doesn't really move beyond that top layer. Whereas if that organic top layer is not present, you can see that it leaches deeper into the profile. This still doesn't really tell you how further or how much further it travels into the soil. There's a more advanced model still that can actually model that transport towards groundwater or models the runoff to surface waters. But this is a very helpful tool to assess the migration potential of chemicals into the soil. Next slide, please. And so the next step up is to simulate the runoff and leaching of chemicals deeper into the profile or from an application site to a nearby water body. And so, so those models are now available, where they link the pesticide root zone model with some kind of, in this case, a surface water model. Using that model, you can assess what the possible concentrations can be in a nearby water. The next few slides show some examples of that. So it's basically a model that, again, takes a lot of information about the sites, about the chemicals. Weather data are actually part of the input. They simulate 30 years of applications and environmental fate processes, and you can get weather data for various different local areas, so you can make it specific to the area of interest. And so it does all the, it simulates all the different processes that are relevant. So I'm showing some examples of where I compare different scenarios or different chemicals for one scenario, and so I've used that to establish some basis for comparison of like old and new chemistries. The cranberry scenarios, I've used them for several cases to inform applicators about what the differences in behavior is of pesticides that they may use. Next slide, please. So this is first, this is atrazine on corn. That is a scenario that is, especially when you go to the Midwest where corn is really big. This is an issue. Atrazine is actually on our groundwater protection list, and so it is a chemical that has potential to leach. And as you can see, so this is a graph that shows the concentration in a pond. Oh no, a reservoir actually. A reservoir that is adjacent to a field where corn is growing, and so this model simulates what happens in the pond water over the years. In this case, every 3 years, a pesticide is applied, and in certain years, when weather conditions favor the runoff, you can see that concentrations got up to like between 40 and 50 ppb at times. Those are the highest values. But this is, again, EPA uses these models to evaluate and say, hey, these levels of, say, 50 ppb, are they of concern? So they compare that with toxicological data or benchmarks or regulatory standards, and see if action needs to be taken, whether the label should have language on there that it shouldn't be used that often, or there should be further restrictions on the label to minimize that exposure to surface water. Next slide, please. And so the model can also at the same time simulate groundwater exposure with that same scenario. This graph shows the groundwater concentrations that could occur. And as you can see, there are years that the groundwater concentrations get above 30 ppb there. Again, so that is information that can be compared with monitoring study results. And so over the years, these models have become more accurate by over the years, comparing these model results with monitoring data and making sure that, because ultimately that's what you want. If you want to use these tools for regulatory purposes or evaluations, we have to make sure that they are realistic. And so as long as the input guidance is followed, these models can give you some helpful information. Next slide, please. This is 2,4-D on corn, surface water impact, again showing in certain years that you can find 2,4-D in the water. But if you compare it to the previous slides, the levels are much lower. The highest is here about 9 or so. So the levels are much lower compared to atrazine. Next slide. And interestingly, the groundwater exposure with 2,4-D in that scenario is almost non-existent in most years. It doesn't even show up, and if it shows up here, it's very low in concentration. 2,4-D is a chemical that may leach, but to some extent, but it is not persistent. It has a relatively short half-life, so it's not going to be around long enough to leach further into the soil. Next slide. Oh yeah, and then a few more scenarios. Cranberry scenario, where I compare two different products, where one, the delegate, is a chemical that binds very strongly to soil, and so this modeling result shows that there shouldn't be significant concern about surface water impacts, whereas diazinon is a chemical that leaches or has more runoff potential and therefore shows up in groundwater in certain years at levels that are much higher than other years. But again, the levels that are simulated, you can compare those with standards and see if there's a concern. Next slide. This is Intrepid, again, compared with Delegate. Intrepid is also, and that is methoxyfenicide, which is on the groundwater protection list. And there's a clear difference in behavior between these chemicals, as you can see. Next slide. And two more chemicals. Actara is thiamethoxam, which is also on the groundwater protection list, but it has runoff potential as these data illustrate. Next slide. And then chlorothalonil is a fungicide that is widely used in various different scenarios. And this slide shows that in corn there is much higher runoff potential compared to cranberry scenarios. And that makes sense. Corn land is generally more susceptible to runoff compared to cranberry bogs, where you have a perennial vegetation that limits the runoff. Okay, and then there is the pesticide root zone model that is combined with a groundwater transport model to specifically evaluate leaching. And so again, you have to have the input information relative to soil type and field and crop characteristics, weather data, pesticide applications, and depth to the groundwater. And so again, a helpful tool to to assess the leaching potential. Next slide, please. And so this is what the model basically simulates, an agricultural, or it's based on an agricultural scenario, but it can be used and it can be adapted for other situations too. But one can evaluate different scenarios in terms of the different groundwater depths and how much of a difference that makes. And so that is something that I illustrate here in the next slide. So I use this model to evaluate one of the herbicides that are used in rights-of-way management, metsulfuron, and so I compared the scenario of a groundwater depth of 10 meters versus 3 meters. And so, again, it simulates for 30 years, or I assumed one application in year 0, and then the model shows when it appears and what the levels are in groundwater. And with a groundwater depth of 10 meters, it shows up, it takes about 10 years before it even breaks through. And then it gets up to a peak level a few years later, but still at very low concentrations. With a 3 meter groundwater depth, as one can expect, it will show up much earlier, and it also shows up at higher levels. But again, these levels are then compared to human health benchmarks when you consider drinking water use, and so that can be used to make an assessment of if there is a concern or not. And then I also modeled, just to illustrate, a different chemical and its behavior, glyphosate. And as I pointed out earlier, glyphosate is a chemical that binds very strongly to soil. And so the model shows here that it doesn't reach groundwater. It doesn't show up in groundwater, so that is in contrast to that previous chemical that I simulated there. So just a summary of this part. Understanding and awareness of the environmental fate processes can help you to minimize exposure to water resources, and thereby also minimize impacts to human health and the environment. Site assessments can be made to select, the proper application methods and products, and consider certain restrictions when needed, when the application site has certain sensitivities relative to the environmental fate. And so site assessments can include, should include the assessment of sensitive areas near the application site. Are there surface waters nearby? Sensitive non-targets such as pollinators. Site characteristics in terms of soil and grade should be considered. Assess the weather conditions, precipitation, air stability, wind direction, and speed, and then make decisions on the pesticide application accordingly. And then the use of the modeling tools, they are very helpful to provide a refined assessment of pesticide fate, where you can address specific scenarios. And so they are mainly used by regulators and scientists to evaluate different scenarios. But yeah, some models are relatively simple that you don't need that much information and knowledge to actually get a number and say, if you just want to know what is the potential concentration that could happen in groundwater, you could actually, there are some models available that are fairly easy to use. And again, these also provide a basis for regulatory evaluations and decisions. Okay, this is something I'm not going to do that is left over from a previous time that I showed it. And then briefly, before we go to a break, I think, groundwater is certainly here on Nantucket and in several other areas in the state is a major resource of drinking water, if not the sole source of drinking water. And so we have regulations in place that are in place to ensure the proper protection from contamination by pesticides. I will go over those regulations later on, but this part just goes over some general approaches to protect groundwater from pesticides. So groundwater is, as you probably know here, is a source that is linked to surface water through connections through the ground. Next line, please. It recharges, seeps through the soil, and thereby can take with it any chemicals that travel with water. Next line, please. And so the water table is the upper level of the water saturated zone. And aquifers are the larger zones and deeper areas where water resides for a much longer time. And so when one considers the protection of such resources, if there is a concern for leaching or a site is vulnerable, then one should select products that that pose minimal concerns for leaching. Yeah, so aspects one should take into account are such as annual precipitation or the times when heavy rains occur, the soil conditions, the pesticide characteristics, whether it's soluble or not, whether the product has groundwater advisory language on the label, and the depth of groundwater are all important aspects. And then in general, just to consider groundwater protection, and it's part of the regulatory criteria too, use IPM in general. Consider the geology, the depth of groundwater, as I mentioned earlier. Consider soil characteristics. Is it susceptible to leaching? Select pesticides carefully. Sometimes, or if you have alternatives that pose less risk to groundwater, that may be a better way to go. And then last but not least, follow label directions. There may be language on there that specifically addresses that. And then regarding vulnerable areas, areas with sandy soils, which is of course very relevant here on Nantucket. Sinkholes maybe not, but well locations, the location of streams, ponds, and again, shallow groundwater. And then, handle pesticides also to ensure that any potential spill or waste is not going to contaminate soils. And Calibration, of course, is important. Calibration of equipment and leaks. The measurement of product should be accurate such that you don't over-apply the product. Mix locations should be considered when you want to minimize impact to groundwater. Next slide, please. And equipment setup aspects are relevant. Especially, this is more related to chemigation that is used in cranberries. I think that's where the slide originates from, but that's where they have these issues with the potential that pesticide can get into water. And if spills occur, properly clean up. First of all, avoid spills and next slide, please. Dispose of wastes should be done properly to prevent any impacts. And storage of pesticides should also be in such a way that the risk is minimal to water resources. And then the groundwater protection regulations and restrictions may apply to certain products in certain situations, as I will explain later. And of course, do not apply pesticides if heavy rain is in the forecast. That is a common sense approach to minimize impacts to groundwater and other water resources. I'll get to this later, but this is a screenshot of our website where I will go over later on with the requirements for groundwater protection regulations. I think at this point it may be a good time to take a break, right? Oh yeah, this is already, oh yeah, wait.
That's fine.
Yeah, okay, this one, yeah. Oh yeah, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is go over some studies that have looked at what pesticides occur in waters here in the region, in Massachusetts, and even closer by in Cape Cod, just to show you some examples of what is found and what the levels were. And so the first one, so there are several agencies that do such studies at the national level. USGS is an agency that does a lot of work related to water quality. And pesticides is one of their areas of interest. And so that is one study. And then we also at times do some monitoring of surface water, sometimes groundwater, to find out whether our regulatory program is protective of waters from exposure of pesticide use, and then as I mentioned earlier, we have been working with people on Cape Cod to address concerns related to pesticide use, so I as a scientist keep an eye out for studies that are done there. We are currently not doing any work there, but in the future we actually may do some monitoring studies there too, just to address those concerns and making sure that our regulations are protective of contamination. So the next slide, please. The first one, the first study was done by USDS in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I think I have this presentation or this study in here because I used this study to build on it and do some additional modeling or no, monitoring, I should say, in Massachusetts. But USDS had a sort of a regional focus, the New England coastal basin that includes Eastern Mass, and they were focusing on, or they actually included pesticides in that study too, and looking at different land uses, urban versus agriculture, groundwater, surface water. So next slide, please. And regarding surface water, they actually found more detections of pesticides in surface water near urban areas. There's certainly a substantial use of pesticides in urban areas on landscapes and maintaining properties. And so there were among the pesticides that were detected at that time, diazinon. It was an insecticide at that time, still had residential uses that was phased out a few years later. Prometon is an herbicide that is used in property management rights of way. Carbaryl is also an insecticide that has quite a wide use pattern. And then atrazine is a kind of an odd one there. It's a corn herbicide basically that may have originated from some areas nearby that where corn growing was still taking place. And then simazine is also is a chemical that is on the groundwater protection list, but has uses in property management rights of way. Well, not in Massachusetts, but it is a product that is known to be mobile and shows up in surface water apparently. And some of the two insecticides that were detected, they actually, in some cases, they exceeded guidelines. Not necessarily for these two chemicals, there are no regulatory standards that can be enforced, but there are guidelines that can help states or other organizations to evaluate whether the levels are of concern. Next slide, please. Specifically for data from Massachusetts in that study include samples from the Charles River and Aberjona River, which is Winchester, Woburn, and again the same chemicals are detected, and in addition to those, also tebutyron, but all of them, as you can see, they are at very low levels, less than 1 part per billion. So laboratory techniques nowadays are so sensitive that they can find stuff, but finding stuff is one thing. To determine whether there is a concern, we have to compare them with benchmarks or other reference points to determine whether there is a concern. So these studies show that when pesticides are being used there is a potential, and at times they do occur in water resources, and that is something that is that regulations address to make sure that they are not exceeding levels of concern. Next slide. Then, so that's what this slide shows, the comparison of the measured concentrations with standards or benchmarks. And as one can see, so the blue bars are the measured values, the pinkish bars are the standards, and so the values are in most cases well below standards. In case of diazinon, and that was, I mentioned that earlier, that is getting a little bit higher relative to the standard, but still in this graph it doesn't exceed the standard. That may have been in specific samples where it exceeded the standard. Next slide, please. Then they included drinking water wells in that study. And so they, of the 44 pesticides that they included in the analysis, 5 were detected. They were all below 20 parts per billion. I'm not sure where that value is in reference to, but that is not a regulatory standard or so, but that was reported by USGS. But as you can see, there's a breakdown product from atrazine, simazine again shows up, tebutyron, prometon, atrazine, but none of these exceeded the standards for those chemicals. Next slide. And so for Massachusetts specifically again, 15 wells were sampled, 3 wells where pesticides were detected. And so the prometon, simazine, tebutyron at levels less than 1 ppb. So they were found at times, but below levels of concern. Next slide, please. And that is illustrated here again, that the levels were below the level of concern or standards. And then, when I started in the department, there was an interest to do additional study or to do an additional monitoring study following up on USGS work to see what is occurring in certain suburban areas. And so we selected Spy Pond in Arlington and the Aberjona River again to collect samples during 2 seasons. And we collected on a bi-weekly schedule samples in a number of locations in these water bodies, and we also included rain events as sampling events. So during and after the rain events, we collected samples. So next slide, please. So this is the Aberjona River watershed. Next slide, please. And so the herbicides that were analyzed for included, atrazine, because it was found by USGS. We didn't expect that anymore. But we included it just to verify that. 2,4-D, dicamba, micoprop. So these are all herbicides used on turf and lawns. Prometon, simazine, quinclorac are also herbicides used in property management. And then insecticides, carbaryl, chlorpyrifos, diazinon, and imidacloprid were included. So we took we took 118 samples. 45 samples contained 1 or more pesticides. And most of the detections were in samples that were taken after rain events. So that makes sense that runoff occurs and that you will find some residues of herbicides or pesticides in the water bodies nearby. Among the herbicides, 2,4-D was the most frequently detected pesticide, but all at levels of less than 1 ppb. Prometon was also detected, and atrazine was still detected once, I believe, which is surprising, given that there's no corn being grown in that area anymore. But for some reason, it's still detected this corn herbicide. Insecticides that were detected included carbaryl and imidacloprid. Diazinon was detected in the first year of monitoring. That was kind of surprising, given that diazinon was actually phased out from residential use. It's only labeled, I believe, for certain crop uses now still. And the same thing for chlorpyrifos. That was not detected. That was phased out from non-crop uses. Next slide, please. That shows the this slide shows the detections during the monitoring study, and it basically shows that most of the detections were found in samples that were taken following rain events, and a few detections at other times during the regular scheduled sampling. Next slide, please. And again, this is this is for 2,4-D, which again shows that detections following rainfall sampling events is where you find it most frequently. Next slide, please. And again, so what we did was compare these detected levels with aquatic life benchmarks to see if there's any concern. And so the measured blue bars are compared with the aquatic life benchmarks for fish and invertebrates, and that's where one can see that for carbaryl and diazinon, they sometimes approach the benchmarks for invertebrates, and that is one reason why diazinon became more restricted. It was phased out from residential use. One of the reasons was the toxicity, the aquatic toxicity, specifically related to invertebrates. And carbaryl is still registered for that use, but as one can see, there are in some cases approaching levels that could cause impacts to invertebrates. For the other two, we're not approaching any levels of concern. And this is another slide showing that comparison for additional pesticides were analyzed for. And one can see that imidacloprid in the middle there is also approaching the benchmarks for invertebrates, and that is one thing that I will point out in a little bit later too. Imidacloprid is the most recent risk assessments that have been done also identify risks to aquatic organisms, or specifically invertebrates. And so that is something that may actually be the basis for some additional restrictions by EPA even. Next slide, please. And even though these waters were not used for drinking water resources, this graph compares the levels that were found, the highest levels that were found with human health benchmarks or standards, regulatory standards. And it shows that they are all below those benchmarks and standards. And so we actually we took the effort to write this up, and it was actually published a few years ago in a scientific journal. So it is out there for other people to to review and use the information. Next slide, please. So then I was going to point out some studies that were done on Cape Cod. Again, we have an interest in information about pesticide occurrence, especially in groundwater. And so there is the Silent Spring Institute has been doing research on Cape Cod for many years. And so they actually have published studies where they have done water sampling of drinking water supplies, both public and private too, actually. This study focused on public drinking water supplies, and so and the focus was actually on emerging contaminants, so pharmaceuticals, personal care products, but they also included herbicides and flame retardants. And so specifically related to the data for herbicides was of interest for us to take a look at. Even though the study wasn't really set up to evaluate the pesticides use and occurrence, it is information that is helpful. And so they did find they did find low levels of a number of chemicals, but none of the herbicides were detected. And the herbicides they analyzed for were actually all herbicides or herbicides that were used for lawn care and turf management. It included one or two from the Rights Away herbicide program. Then there was another study where they actually sampled domestic drinking water wells, private wells, and again tested for a wide range of organic wastewater compounds. So they linked these detections of these compounds to wastewater wastewater that are on Cape Cod is an important source of these groundwater contaminants. They included 8 herbicides again, but none of them were detected in any sample. So we know that there is a wide use of pesticides on Cape Cod. But again, none of the herbicides that were analyzed for were detected in the groundwater. Another study that our department was involved in was related to the rights-of-way management. That was done as part of the assessment of regulatory setbacks that are part of the rights-of-way regulations. They have setbacks from sensitive areas and waters, and the committee that was evaluating and the regulations wanted to have some data on the effectiveness of these setbacks. And so this study was done with the application of glyphosate products along a railroad, and so they followed the regulatory setback distances from the water bodies, and the water bodies were sampled, and it showed that no herbicide or its breakdown product AMPA was found in any of these samples. So that was this study result was based or was used to support that setback value that is in the regulations for rights of way. So these regulations for rights of way actually go beyond label instructions. So on top of the label requirements, applicators have to follow these regulations specifically for rights of way. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, and then so I'm going to review some resources for pesticides that may be helpful for you. I was wondering if you can try to, see if it works, because I sometimes see, they were, So this is one site that one source that I use a lot. So you can basically type in any chemical name. If you can type glyphosate.
Don't ask me to spell something crazy.
What about glyphosate? If you enter that, so it's, And so that brings you to an overview. So if you can click on glyphosate there, the first one. That brings you to an overview of this pesticide. If you, so it gives you a lot of information. If you go back up, there are tabs for, so there are chemical details here, but regulatory actions, you can see where, what is going on. So this is an EPA website. So there are a number of documents available. If you can go up again. So you can find the latest regulatory actions related to the chemical. And you can see that the latest one here is the draft human health and ecological risk assessment of this chemical and some others. And it is currently open for comment, for public comment. So EPA looks for input from a variety of audiences on these draft risk assessments. So the public can comment. The registrants actually use this to comment on these risk assessments. And so you can do that here. You can see there's a button there, comment now, and you can just enter your comment there. And you can actually see that, currently there are 948 comments that have been received. It's open for public comment until the end of the month. But anyway, for any chemical, you can find what the actions are currently. It's when you can go to the dockets where all the risk assessment documents are, and you can. So there's a wealth of information that is accessible through this website. That may be of interest if you want to know more about what is going on. So we can go back to the slide. So that's basically what I pointed out here. If you can go to the next slide. That was actually a screenshot in case the internet wasn't available. I think we have that website. We already have it open, but if you click on the first one, the first one is the National Pesticide Information Center. This is a collaboration of EPA with, in this case, it's Oregon State University, I think, and they collaborate to provide this support and staffing of this National Pesticide Information Center. I actually have flyers here. If you can, they have a wealth of information about pesticides available. The webinars are now available there. Apparently, this is this website has been updated significantly. But they are also a good source. If you have questions, if you want to talk to someone, you can call them, and they have staff that is trained in answering questions from the public. So it is a good resource. We sometimes go there to have our questions answered. So it is a very helpful resource. Then if you can go back to the slide. When you want to know something about the registration of a product in Massachusetts, this is a database that it is a third party that provides this service, but we provide every month with the latest updated registration information of all pesticide products in Massachusetts. And so you can do a search. As the first link there is a pesticide search. You can do that by pesticide product name. You can, if you click on that, you'll get should get a window with where you can enter a product name, but you can do it by active ingredient and some other criteria. No, okay, that's yeah. But this is a source where it is one of the sources where you can easily find out about the registration status of a pesticide in Massachusetts. So that may be a helpful resource. And then I referred to human health benchmarks for pesticides a few times. That is also a very helpful database. It was actually something that the states requested from EPA, because states they do monitoring, they do assessments. If they do a monitoring study like I showed earlier, they find certain levels of pesticides, and prior to this information available on the web, it was difficult for the states to make a quick assessment whether action should be taken for certain monitoring results to determine whether the levels were of concern. And so the states worked with EPA to make this information available, that the human health benchmarks are not enforceable, but they are there to inform states and other interested parties about the levels that are a reference for the determination of whether levels that are found are of concern or not. So you can, if you click on this, it will bring you to a website where you can enter or search for a chemical, and it will give you the benchmarks for different scenarios, acute versus chronic, etc. There's a similar website. I didn't show that, but there's also one for aquatic life benchmarks values. So for fish and invertebrates, you can actually find benchmarks values too. So that is something that.
Are those EPA sites?
Yeah, they are EPA websites. So EPA, these benchmarks are based on the risk assessments, the most current risk assessments for that chemical. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not sure. This is something I like to do after the next break. Let me see what the. Do we have a break or no? Yeah. Well, actually, what we can do now is maybe go over the groundwater protection regulations and then take a break.
Cool.
Yeah.
Which slide?
That is the other presentation, actually. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned it earlier. There are groundwater protection regulations specifically for pesticides. And then specifically for for drinking water supply protection. And actually it's for public drinking water supply protection. And so basically to determine whether the regulations, whether you should consider the restrictions that are in the regulations, you have to ask the questions of whether your product that you plan to use is on the groundwater protection list. That's the first question. Then you have to determine whether the application site is in a regulated primary recharge area, so in Zone 2 or in the individual wellhead protection area. And then if you have a product that is on the list, and if you're in a regulated recharge area, then you have to find out whether you are in compliance with the regulations. So, next slide, please. So the groundwater protection list is the first thing where you look at. So the groundwater protection list is a list of pesticides that have been evaluated by the Pesticide Board Subcommittee and that evaluation takes into account leaching potential and toxicological concerns as specified in the regulations. And the next line, please. So those chemicals that are on that list, they are all restricted use products. They're either federally restricted, and if not, then we will make them restricted at the state level. Next slide, please. And so they are on the website, and I think this is still the old one. You can go to the next slide. This is a screenshot of the current list, and so there are quite a few older chemicals on there that may not have such high use anymore, or some of them may not even be registered anymore, like lindane. But there are a number of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides that are on the list. And so if the product has a wide area use pattern, then they are state-restricted use products. And so we had a recent update with that one chemical that was, that's fine, yeah. Next slide, please. So that was a list of chemicals, of active ingredients that you have to check for. Now, whether you're in a regulated primary recharge area, and that's where you will have to find out whether the application area is in a Zone 2 or individual wellhead protection area. Next slide.
Where are we sitting right now? We're in the Zone 2. So we are in,
Yeah, right?
We're in the Wanacom Wellhead Recharge District, which is a Zone 2 area. So if you're using that, you can find it on our website, town website, the GIS website. If you're using a product, you got to be sure that it's corresponding to the list here.
Right. Yeah. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a slide illustrating the hydrologic cycle and where surface water, rainwater, groundwater, how they are all connected. Next slide, please. Another slide illustrating the processes related to that take place in a primary recharge area. Next slide, please. And so Zone 2s are delineated by Mass DEP relative to the drinking water well. And so that is a process that is done for these drinking water wells. That again they are only required for wells that pump more than 100,000 gallons per day. And prior to the Zone 2 delineation, there can be an individual wellhead protection area established that is a simple radius, half-mile radius around the well. And so you can find the Zone 2 map now is readily is easily to you can access that information through Mass GIS. I have a few other screenshots in the other application where that has been getting much easier to get to that information. You can zoom into your local area and find out whether the site is in a Zone 2 area or not. But you can also go to DEP offices, and the local Board of Health should have those maps also available. Next slide, please. And so this is a screenshot of the MassGIS website. And so this map shows a statewide distribution of Zone 2s, but you can zoom in, selecting the data, the map layer that contains that information, and then it shows you where Zone 2 areas are. Next slide, please. And this is just a more detailed screenshot. And I have actually last night I did I quickly checked what the situation was here on Nantucket, and I have a screenshot of that in the other presentation. Next slide, please. And so, so again, the three questions: is your product on the groundwater protection list? And next question is whether your site is in a primary recharge area. What to do next? All right. So there are basically two scenarios, and that is based on the foliar cover. The regulations specify that there's one scenario for the situation where you have more than 50% foliar cover. So that is the situation for like cranberries and turf, and that's where most activities related to the groundwater protection program actually are taking place for uses on cranberry and turf. Next slide, please. Yeah, so 50% or more foliar cover, and the other situation is less than 50% cover, soil applications, things like that. But let's go to scenario one first, the requirements under that situation. So generally, you can only use a product that is on the groundwater protection list in a Zone 2 area in a situation that there is no viable alternative to the use of that specific product. And so that assessment is typically made by extension specialists for that area. And then another requirement is that the applicator must be using an IPA program, an IPM program that is approved by the department. So if you have an existing IPM program that you may have worked with extension to obtain, that is something that we consider a department-approved source. Next slide, please. So if the extension specialist has determined that there is no viable alternative to that specific product, then you may use that product according to the label. But you are required to notify the department of that application. And that needs to be done on a monthly basis. So if you use it 2 times in a given month, you will have to notify the department at at the end or the beginning of the following month what the applications, where and which applications were done. And that can be done online. Next line, please. There's an, if you go to the website, you can enter that information on this form, and I will get it in my email. And it is just a record of the application that we keep in case we have to go back and do some additional assessment. If issues come up, then we have that information. Next slide, please. You can also mail that in. I still get hard copies in the mail. Extension services have these forms available, so I still get those too, but email or online is the most convenient way now. Scenario 2 is something that is not really, it is a process that is outlined in the regulations. It's basically much more cumbersome. You have to basically do a lot more, you have to get a lot more information, work with NRCS specialists on assessments for the application side, and for certain agricultural operations, they have done it in the past, where they were in an area and they could only use a certain product and it was on the groundwater protection list, and so they went through the process. You have to submit a plan with all these elements in there, or with certain things that are specified in the regulations. Next slide, please. And then once we receive, so that has to be in there. And then once we receive it, we have to share that with colleagues from Mass DEP and DPH. They have to get back to us, and then we have to make the determination whether the plan is approved or not, and then you can go ahead. But yeah, as you can see, there's a 60-day turnaround. It takes time. It's for most situations, it's apparently too cumbersome to do that. So the last 5-6 years, I haven't had requests for this pesticide management plan. And again, that may have to do with, that alternatives are available. If there are alternatives available, then it is more easier to go that route. So next slide, please. And again, that's all related to the all the elements of a pesticide management plan. And again, that is not much used anymore. It is a process that was put in place at a time when the regulations, these groundwater protection regulations, were put in place. But that was done I believe in the late 80s, early 90s. And it may have worked at that time for certain users, but at this time it's not really used anymore. So the regulations allow the use of these chemicals, but the regulations are in place to protect drinking water resources. Okay. And so this is just a flow chart that is also online that helps you to find out which route you have to take in this regulatory process. But again, the most common activity is notification of certain pesticides, and basically, I think there are. Chlorothalonil is one that is still, I get notifications from certain golf course superintendents that still have sometimes a need for that product, and they are in a zone 2, and so I get those applications. The same thing, chlorothalonil in cranberries sometimes is needed, but those are I think the bulk of the notifications that I get. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's my contact information related to this program. So maybe it's a good time to take a break, and then the final session will be on specific pesticides that were brought up, questions related to that, so I'm going to do that after the break. And that will be, and we can do the Q&A.
During that?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. These are the watersheds, and then these are the wellhead protection districts. So what I got up here, just for your information, this is with the aerial, but these are our wellhead protection districts. This is for Sconset, and this is for the Neonicotinoids. So again, as you think about the regulated list, also just as an aside, which I hope you're all familiar by now, this is the Nantucket Harbor Watershed District. It's blue. This is just a 100-foot buffer from the water or something or other. This is Wijnja. No, this is Hummock, sorry. Wijnja's not listed here. This is Nantucket. So remember, as you apply your product, remember what watershed you're in and the sensitive degrading resources in that watershed. Also, Steve asked me about groundwater maps. We did a groundwater map way back in the 80s before Lee Witten that basically has the groundwater contours. So if you're using a product that's not just sensitive in terms of sandy soils, but in shallow groundwater, you should know where the groundwater is there. And I can pull up a link at some point, or I'll get that out just through educational sources. But you should know. Most of the places in the harbor watershed, on the left-hand side or the north side of Fulpus, groundwater is pretty shallow. In and around Noshop, that's where the groundwater is the deepest, about 40 feet around there. So as you expand out to the other side, it gets a lot more shallower. Just again, as you got to be aware of each situation, each property that you're working on in terms of its characteristics. And then where do we want to start?
Go back to the other presentation.
Which one?
Let's see. Right. Yeah, this one. Yeah. Yeah, this is fine. So at the time when we were planning this this event, I was given a list of, apparently, applicators were surveyed for what pesticides are of interest to talk about, and so I got a list with a number of pesticides on there, and so I'm first going to go over glyphosate, which is number 1 on the list. The neonicotinoids, just an update that I have in this presentation too, and then I'll go over some other pesticides of interest, and then I'll just open it up for questions too that you may have. So next slide, please.
I'm just going to, do you mind if I jump in?
No,
Just
yeah.
to give you an update on what happened with the glyphosate issue, if you weren't aware, there was a petition at town meeting to ban it. That got changed and morphed into a different proposal, which essentially it got referred to the Board of Health for further regulatory review. So how that's going to wind its way through the Board of Health, we're not sure yet. As the Land Council, we were a little concerned about some unintended consequences of a straight-out ban, and people moving to different products that would be more harmful, and then also inabilities to use rodeo in certain applications for invasive species control. And then I think there was some other concerns from the other communities, such as the landscaping community and others, which shared the same interest. But that's where we're at right now, in case you guys were wondering with that.
Okay. So glyphosate, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a product that is getting a lot of attention in the media, and so I like to point out that glyphosate is in the final stages of the process, what is known as registration review, which is an EPA is required to periodically review every registered pesticide to make sure that it meets current standards and is up to date with the most current science. And so most pesticides, many pesticides actually are going through this process now. It is a process that takes at least 7 years because it is typically it requires registrants to do additional studies to bring it up to current standards. In this registration review process, EPA also considers other studies that are not done by registrants, but they are out there in peer-reviewed journals, and so they consider that those studies too. They screen them, make sure that they are that they meet the established standards and data requirements, and so. Earlier, I showed you that website where you can find for any given pesticides. You can type that in, and you will find information on regulatory actions. And registration review is one of them for most chemicals. And glyphosate was supposed to have a registration review decision already last year or so, but it got actually it got delayed through, and it has to do with all the attention to what I'll get to in the next slide, the cancer classification by the Iarc committee, and so as I pointed out earlier, currently there are draft risk assessments open for public comment. And in the latest EPA risk assessment document for human health, it is pointed out that EPA or the advisory committee for the cancer classification for glyphosate came to the conclusion that glyphosate is not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. And so that is in contrast to the conclusion by the Iarc committee a few years ago. So it is expected that there's an interim review decision on glyphosate by early next year. And so that decision will likely be a basis for updating labels, but based on the risk assessment, I've taken a quick look at what is in these draft risk assessments. There are no major risks that were found with the current use. There may be certain issues with as I will, if you can go to the next slide. So the Iarc evaluation of glyphosate a couple of years ago got a lot of attention, and that's where the general public is focusing mostly on this single report, where they concluded that glyphosate was classified as probably carcinogenic to humans. So there are multiple classes of hazard classifications that they do, and so glyphosate is in this group. It is interesting to note that eating red meat is in this category too. So there's a different, there are a range of activities and chemicals that they have evaluated for carcinogenic potential, but it is a hazard classification, what they did in that publication. It's not a risk assessment. They actually point out on their website that classification was that is the start or the beginning, or it is to inform the subsequent risk assessment, which actually was done by a different committee, but also under the World Health Organization. umbrella. And so that was done, that came out a year later, where they actually conclude that if they actually consider the exposure to humans and how that happens, they concluded that glyphosate does not pose carcinogenic risk to humans through exposure that is by diet. So that includes food and water. So there's a website link that describes that process. It explains why it may at first look in conflict with the earlier conclusions, but they actually go into the detail why this is an outcome of the risk assessment that was initiated by the first publication. Next slide, please. And so it is interesting to note that several other pesticide regulatory agencies came to the same conclusion, that the European Food Safety Authority also concluded that glyphosate was unlikely to pose carcinogenic hazard to humans. Health Canada also concluded in their latest regulatory evaluation that glyphosate is not presenting risks to human health or the environment. Based on Health Canada apparently proposed some revised label directions, but there's a link to that information to there. Next slide. So glyphosate. There is definitely has been a significant increase in the use over the last decade or so, but it is particularly related to the uses on GMO crops. It has many other uses, as you may know, but the GMO crops is a large user of this particular herbicide. It's also an important tool in no-till farming. And in some regions, they actually find weed resistance that has developed most likely due to overuse of glyphosate. It is an easy and economical tool for farmers, but as anyone in pesticide regulation and science and use knows that if you don't rotate chemistries over time, you will run into issues with resistance to the pesticide. The environmental fate, as I pointed out earlier, the environmental fate of glyphosate is characterized by a very strong binding with soils and sediments. And so it is also not persistent in the environment. The half-life is relatively short, and thereby it is not accumulating in the environment. But it is sometimes detected in certain regions, especially in these high-use regions. It is sometimes found in water monitoring studies. Okay, so that was glyphosate. Neonicotinoids, another pesticide very much in the news. Merit is one of the products, and that was on my list too. And so, as you may know, the neonicotinoids have been in the news, particularly related to the pollinator risk, the bee health issue, and the protection efforts that have been underway for several years now. Our department is following that closely, has worked on that too quite a bit. EPA has updated labels and risk assessments to address the concerns and improve the protection to bees. And neonicotinoids, they are also going through that registration review process right now, which was actually expedited, particularly or specifically to address the the issue related to honeybee health. So they have requested additional studies. They have refined risk assessments, and so the latest is that for several neonicotinoids, they have released updated risk assessment, draft risk assessments that were out for public comment last year, I think. And so they had pollinator-specific risk assessments where they identified risks to bees with certain crops, but not every crop. It has to do with whether a crop is bee attractive, and so the other risk assessments that are out there for neonicotinoids, there are several of them that indicate a significant risk to aquatic organisms, particularly the invertebrates. And they actually, because they now, from what I understand, they have a different organism that they use as a test organism. I think it's the mayfly, and that seems to be more sensitive. So the endpoints are becoming more sensitive, and so the risks that are identified in the risk assessment process are now more substantial, and so it is something that could trigger some additional restrictions with the final risk assessments and the registration review decisions that probably will come out within the next year or two. Environmental fate of neonicotinoids is characterized by being persistent and also mobile, so that both solubility and the low binding affinity favor the mobility in the environment. So it is found in surface waters, sometimes groundwaters, and so it is something that is actually also monitored closely in several different areas, especially in agricultural areas where they use neonicotinoids as seed treatment for like corn and soybeans. So that's where they find things in ground and surface water. Next slide, please. Then some other pesticides of interest that were shared with me. So the insecticide acelepryn, chlorantraniliprole. I actually printed out the label, looked at that, and I looked at some EPA fact sheets for this chemical. The label has groundwater and surface water advisory language on there. The chemical is definitely, it is a very persistent chemical. Half-life values go up to like, I think it was like up to several hundreds of days. So it is a persistent chemical that if it is used on an annual basis, you can actually accumulate over time residues in soils or in the environment in general. And so, but on the other hand, acelepryn or the active ingredient actually, when it was requested for registration by EPA evaluated the chemical and classified it as a reduced risk pesticide, which is basically when they compared it to existing pesticides, the toxicity profile is very favorable. It has very low toxicity compared to others, and so even though it has leaching properties, the levels that could occur in ground and surface water are not likely to be of concern based on the current toxicity data that is available. And so it is one of these chemicals. There's no perfect pesticide out there that does its job for a certain target organism, and many of the newer pesticides are more specific to certain target organisms. But to find a perfect pesticide chemical that does its job and breaks down quickly enough that you don't find it in ground or surface water, or it doesn't have the leaching properties, such chemicals are not out there. What we learned from registrants is that they have to screen thousands and thousands of chemicals just to end up with a few candidates that they are actually taking through a process where they further narrow it down to maybe a few that they will consider to take through the process of like 10 years of studies and millions of dollars to bring it up to actually for consideration by EPA to be registered is a long and expensive process. But this is one of these I think it was registered by EPA in 2008. And it has, again, it has certain favorable aspects, but the leaching properties are something that are part of this chemical. But in combination with its low toxicity profile, it does have certainly a value as an insecticide in many use patterns, and it is compared to some of the alternatives, has a much better profile. It is not systemic compared to the neonicotinoids that are taken up by plants and then end up in pollen and nectar. So the bee toxicity is also favorable compared to the neonicotinoids. It is an insecticide, so it has potential for impacts to bees and all other pollinators, but the mammalian toxicity is very favorable. So there was this one. Then there were a number of fungicides listed as pesticides of interest or things that are being used here. And so there's a whole list of them, about 10 or so that I noticed. But as I pointed out earlier, or one of them was chlorothalonil. Which one is that? Daconil. Daconil was listed as one of the products, which is a chlorothalonil-based product. As I pointed out, that is a chemical that is on the groundwater protection list, or maybe I didn't point it out, but when you look at the list, chlorothalonil is one of them. And so if you're in a zone 2, then you'll have to follow the groundwater protection regulation requirements. And then several fungicides, I looked at labels, and several of them have groundwater and or surface water advisory language on there. And again, that is language to help the applicator inform about the potential, and then in certain situations, one should be very cautious with the use of those products. And the same thing for some herbicides that were listed. Some of them also have that groundwater and surface water advisory language on the label. And for the same reason as I just pointed out, you should be considering that language and that information when you're in a sensitive area where groundwater or surface water exposure is possible. I think those are the. Oh yeah, there was one that was listed, Speed Zone. Oh yeah, Speed Zone is a product that is a combination of 2,4-D, carfentrazone, ethyl, dicamba, and MCPP. It is a state-restricted use pesticide. None of these herbicides are on the groundwater protection list, but Massachusetts still has a requirement or a policy that a subcommittee uses regarding 2,4-D herbicide. And this product contains like, I think it's like 28% 2,4-D, and any product with a concentration of 2,4-D higher than 20% is by that policy is classified as a state-restricted use product. A state-restricted use product, and so Speed Zone is a state-restricted use product, not available not as widely available for use. And so those were the major products that were listed as of interest and being used here. If you have additional questions, I would be happy to answer them. But this was just something that I thought was helpful information regarding those products. Yes.
A couple of other chemicals that the Conservation Commission permits out here are triclopyr and mosquito larvicides. I wonder if there's any particular issues with those chemicals.
The question is that there's use of triclopyr and mosquito larvicides. And your question is if there are any particular issues related to the use of those products in terms of impacts to water resources or in general. Yeah, triclopyr is an herbicide that we actually, it is on the what is known as the sensitive area list for rights-of-way management. So it is actually one of the herbicides that has undergone an additional review at the state level to make sure that the use of that product and then in the context of rights-of-way, they actually have sensitive areas that are defined as water bodies and other areas that could be sensitive in terms of non-target organisms that could be impacted by. So triclopyr has been reviewed for addition to that list. It is on that list. So it has passed that review, and that list of chemicals, the rights of way sensitive area, the materials list, is a resource that is sometimes looked at for uses other than in rights of way. So if you go to our website, there is a website specifically for rights of way vegetation management. You can actually find more information about triclopyr there. There is a summary of that review that was done at the time that was reviewed for that list. And there should be a link to some more recent risk assessments too that may be of interest to you to review. The mosquito larvicides, I don't know if you have any specific products that you. Yeah. They are compared to the products that are used for aerial treatments. The larvicides that's a whole different exposure level. I think BTI is a common product that is or active. Yeah. BTI-based products are commonly used for that purpose too. So they are reviewed at the state level too for that use to make sure that there are no concerns for impacts to known targets and water resources. So as long as they are used according to label, any other applicable regulatory requirements, there shouldn't be a concern for the use of those products.
What do you think about the organic pesticides?
How do you define organic pesticides? that's because organic are
My
so
concern is that people think that since it's organic, it's not as bad, and
Right.
they overdose.
well. I assume that when you talk about organic pesticides, you consider pesticides that are approved for use in organic production. Yeah, because we actually register quite a few of those that are OMRI listed, right? You're probably familiar with the OMRI listing. That is not done by EPA actually. There's an organization that actually has a process of review to classify certain pesticides or can list them as and include them on the OMRI list, and those are the ones that are approved for use in organic production systems. But they are still registered by EPA. So EPA goes through a risk assessment process. And they have, similar to conventional pesticides, they have label language on there that has certain application rates, certain application frequencies that need to be followed. They may be different from conventional pesticides. They may be able to apply that more frequently, things like that, but there's still label rates specified and all other. EPA takes that through more or less the same risk assessment process for pesticides in general. So the perception that you can apply more and not have issues is not true. It's follow the label. The label is law, and there is a lot behind that label. That is not something that someone writes up at the EPA. There's a lot of research and data analysis and risk assessment that is done before they come up with a label. So that's the bottom line there. Follow the label. Any other questions? Yeah.
I noticed mesotrione, or that's Cijin is labeled as tenacity, has been used a lot in the past few years, especially on island. Are you familiar with any studies done on that?
The question is about the use of tenacity. The active ingredient is mesotrione. And you state that there is an increase in the use of that product on the island? Yeah, and your question is whether I'm aware of any studies any studies, monitoring studies, I mean, related or that look at that active ingredient. I remember mesotrione was one of the first special reviews that I did when I started for the department, so that must have been 2008. I somewhat recall from memory that it was something, I actually probably have the label right here, but it may have some groundwater or surface water advisory language on the label. It is, I remember it does have leaching properties, properties that favor leaching and runoff, or it is not extreme, but I'm not aware of studies that were done in the region, at least. There may be studies out there from the Midwest, maybe, where I can expect that there's a lot more use of it. Because initially it was registered for corn, I think. At the time when I did the special review for registration in the state, I think it was only labeled for corn, and then later on, what typically happens is that initial registrations are for some of the big ag uses, and then later on, the registrant requests additional uses, and turf, I know is one that was added later. And so I'm not aware of studies especially related to turf, but I wouldn't be surprised that it shows up in groundwater at times. But again, it is something that would have to be compared to benchmarks for human health and see if there is a concern for groundwater levels. Yeah. Yes?
When the issues with glyphosate that recently came up on Nantucket, somebody said to me yesterday, would you consider using imazamox instead of glyphosate? And I'm not familiar with that at all.
The question is whether imazamox can be an alternative for glyphosate use. Imazamox, we actually did a review for the use of imazamox for using lakes to control vegetation. That is my most recent work with that chemical. I am not exactly sure if that glyphosate is a non-selective herbicide. It kills any plant, any green plant, and so imazamox is more selective, from what I remember. Yeah, and so it may have. I'm not sure if it is or if the label allows the uses that could be considered, and thereby that it could be considered an alternative for glyphosate-based products. One would have to look at the label again. So that is the first place where you would go look at the labels. Or there are a number of products probably registered with different use patterns. So you could, for instance, you could go to the website that I showed earlier, the Cali Solutions website for Massachusetts-based products. You could look for the imazamox active ingredient and see which products are registered. And when you select the product, you can actually see what the use sites are and the target past. So it is a good way of finding out whether it could be a potential alternative for certain uses. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
In terms of the aquatic life benchmarks, I find that most of them are based in freshwater systems. Is there any research going into looking into coastal aquatic life criteria?
Interesting question. The question is about aquatic life benchmarks, similar to the human health benchmarks. EPA established aquatic life benchmarks, and your question is whether, you noticed that they were for freshwater, and your question is whether there's research going on or plans to expand that for saltwater or marine water conditions. I know that for most pesticides, the standard test organisms, they include several marine organisms. So if you're if you're interested in learning more about the toxicity for specifically for marine organisms, aquatic organisms, you could go to the environmental risk assessments for that chemical that you can probably find through that chemical search database. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. I'm not aware of efforts to expand the aquatic life benchmarks for other than freshwater organisms at this time. It is again, it is something that that was done by EPA at a request from states to have benchmarks. But yeah, in the situation here where you have the marine organisms as a potential non-target, it would be helpful information. I'm not aware of an easy resource of getting that, so but I can look into it if you want, and if I find an easier route than going to the risk assessment documents, because that's a little bit of digging that you have to do, and then you still have some numbers that are not necessarily easy to work with. So yeah.
Shellfish specifically, I know that for the marine criteria, it's mostly fish species, but
Yeah. Yeah, the one of the standard organisms, the eastern oyster, is an test that is typically done for many pesticides, and some marine invertebrates species are also well, sometimes done, I should say, because it is from my experience it is not always done, and it is not unusual that it is identified as a data gap by EPA, but then based on existing knowledge, they can sometimes say, well, if the toxicity to freshwater organisms is very low, it is not expected that it will be so much difference for marine organisms. But in certain situations, they actually identify a data gap and say, hey, there's an uncertainty in the risk and we cannot say, or there could be a potential risk. So, yeah. But yeah, maybe there is a summary somewhere that someone had the same question. Yeah.
because all of the people in this room are obviously working in Nantucket or soils that are similar to Cape Cod soils.
Yeah.
Have you found in the research that you've done that our type of soils, which are like Eatsboro type kind of sandy soils, that certain pesticides are more preferred than others, just as an example, or it really depends on what you're trying to, what the end goal is?
So the question is, given the type of soils that are common here on the island, if I know that there's guidance on the preference for using certain pesticides over others in terms of leaching potential. It is, like you already suggested, it depends on where you want to use it for and the alternatives that could be available. If you have to consider the use of a certain product and you learn that it may have some groundwater or language on the label that makes you think twice about using it and may look for alternatives. It's there's not an easy resource that could quickly give you a few alternatives. I think it's on a case-by-case basis that would have to be evaluated, and that is not but it is something, especially in sensitive areas, with the types of soils that you have here. Groundwater advisory language on the label should be something that should be considered and evaluated, and see if there are alternatives available for that particular pest control and use site.
So if it shows up on that right-of-way sensitive area
Yeah.
list, with that, if you were between two and one showed up
Yeah.
on that list, would you say you should use that one?
Well, that's how. The question is, or the comment is, in regard to the rights-of-way sensitive area materials list. There are a number of herbicides on there that have undergone that additional review, and so people actually look at that as a resource for in this case herbicides that actually have undergone that additional review, and so it has been determined that the use of those herbicides, according to the labels, is not causing unreasonable impacts to drinking water resources as well as ecological risks. Yeah, so it is used by people for a list of chemicals that they see as a list of chemicals that has undergone additional scrutiny by state agencies for the use in sensitive areas, and so it is used in that way. Yeah, but again, you will have to look at labels, whether it actually can be used for that particular use pattern that you would be considering it for. But it is a potential source of chemicals that have undergone additional scrutiny and have gone through that and have been approved for use in sensitive areas. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, the take-home message that I have in there, I addressed environmental fate aspects and issues. They are important considerations for minimizing risks, both to human health and the environment. And applicators and growers have a role in that, in selecting the methods and products that they want to use, and also make sure that you're in compliance with the applicable regulations. The regulations are in place for a reason, such as groundwater protection regulations, and the knowledge about environmental fate and all the different aspects that are relevant to pesticide applications help you to make a better professional judgment in situations where that is needed. And ultimately, the purpose is to make sure that we protect human health and the environment, but also at the same time that we have sufficient pest control methods and tools available for, well, I have growers here, but there are many other types of pesticide use patterns out there, management of properties where the same principles apply. So that's my take-home message. This is, we are regulators. We have a role, but you as users and applicators have also a role in this. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll be around maybe for, if you have additional questions, please let me know. And I have my contact information is on the next slide, but you can, that's easily accessible on the website too. But with that, thank you for the opportunity.